1807, South China Sea. Over 1,800 vessels fly under a single command. Not an emperor's, not a king's, but a woman's. Her name is Ching Shih, and she commands more than 80,000 pirates, controls the world's most powerful pirate fleet, and strikes terror into the hearts of the Chinese Imperial Navy, Portuguese warships, and British colonial forces. Within 3 years, she'll negotiate one of history's most brilliant surrenders, retiring wealthy and pardoned, while her enemies who tried to destroy her are left humiliated. This is the story of a former courtesan who became the most successful pirate commander in human history. A woman who proved that intelligence, discipline, and ruthless strategy could build an empire on the waves that no military power could defeat. The woman who would become known to history as Ching Shih was born around 1775 in Canton, modern Guangzhou, China, during the Qing dynasty's reign. Her original name is lost to history. She's known only by names describing her relationships to men. First as Shi Shanggu, and later as Ching Shih, meaning widow of Cheng. This erasure of her birth name is typical of how history has treated women, but it makes her subsequent achievements even more remarkable. She rose from complete obscurity and powerlessness to command respect and fear across the South China Sea. Her early life was spent working on a floating brothel, essentially a boat that served as a prostitution venue in Canton's harbor. This work wasn't chosen from vast opportunities, but was one of the very limited options available to poor women in Qing dynasty China. The floating brothels served sailors, merchants, and various men who frequented the harbor, providing entertainment and companionship in a society where such services were segregated from respectable life. It was hard, dangerous work that offered minimal security and no prospect of advancement. Most women in Ching Shih's position would spend their entire lives in this profession, aging out of desirability and ending their days in poverty. But Ching Shih possessed qualities that distinguished her from others in similar circumstances. Historical accounts suggest she was unusually beautiful, which gave her access to wealthier and more influential clients. More importantly, she was intelligent, observant, and capable of reading people and situations with remarkable accuracy. She understood power dynamics, could negotiate skillfully, and recognized opportunities that others missed. These abilities would later make her an extraordinary military and political leader, but they first manifested in her ability to navigate the dangerous world of Canton's floating brothels more successfully than most. In 1801, her life changed dramatically when she caught the attention of Cheng Yi, one of the most powerful pirate commanders operating in South China waters. Cheng Yi commanded a substantial pirate fleet and was part of a long tradition of organized piracy in the region. Chinese piracy in this era wasn't random banditry, but was highly organized, with different pirate fleets operating under coded agreements, controlling specific territories, and sometimes cooperating in confederations that could challenge government authority. Cheng Yi was a significant player in this world, commanding respect and resources. Why Cheng Yi chose to marry a prostitute from a floating brothel rather than selecting a wife from a respectable family is a question that historical records don't fully answer. Perhaps he was attracted by her intelligence and personality. Perhaps he recognized qualities in her that would make her a valuable partner in the dangerous business of piracy. Perhaps their relationship began as purely transactional and evolved into something more. Whatever his initial motivations, the decision to marry her was unusual enough that it required negotiations and agreements that went beyond typical marriages. The marriage contract that Ching Shih negotiated with Cheng Yi was extraordinary for its time and reveals much about her character and ambitions. She didn't simply accept whatever terms he offered, but insisted on conditions that gave her real power and security. According to historical accounts,
She demanded equal partnership in his pirate enterprise, including shared command authority and equal division of all plunder and profits. This was revolutionary in a society where wives were subordinate to husbands in all matters, where women couldn't own property independently, and where female authority over men was virtually unthinkable. That Cheng Yi agreed to these terms suggests either that he was unusually progressive in his views about gender,
or that he recognized Ching Shih had abilities valuable enough to warrant such concessions, or that she negotiated so skillfully that he concluded agreement was in his interests. The marriage created a genuine partnership rather than a traditional subordinate relationship, giving Ching Shih opportunities to learn piracy's operational, strategic, and political dimensions. She wasn't just a wife observing from a distance, but an active participant with authority to make decisions and command respect. During the years of her marriage to Cheng Yi, Ching Shih learned the complex business of organized piracy in the South China Sea. She studied naval tactics and combat, learning how pirate vessels operated, how they attacked merchant ships, how they evaded government forces. She learned about logistics, how to provision hundreds of ships with food, water, weapons, and other necessities, how to maintain vessels at sea for extended periods, how to establish supply networks along the coast. She learned about leadership and command, understanding how to maintain discipline among thousands of rough men who lived by violence and who weren't naturally inclined toward obedience. Perhaps most importantly, she learned about the political and economic structures that sustained organized piracy. The pirate fleets didn't just randomly attack ships, but operated sophisticated protection racket systems, selling safe passage certificates to merchants, taxing coastal villages, and maintaining relationships with corrupt officials who could be bribed to ignore piracy or even provide intelligence about government operations. These economic foundations made the difference between mere bandits who lived hand-to-mouth and organized forces that could sustain long-term operations and accumulate wealth and power. Cheng Yi was building a confederation of pirate fleets, bringing different independent commanders under a unified structure that would later be known as the Red Flag Fleet. This confederation eventually included multiple fleets distinguished by colored flags: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green. Each commanded by different leaders, but coordinating their operations for mutual benefit. The Confederation created economies of scale, allowed for more ambitious operations than individual fleets could manage, and presented a united front that made it difficult for government forces to defeat them by picking off isolated groups. Ching Shih participated actively in building this confederation, apparently serving as something like a chief of staff or strategic advisor. She helped negotiate agreements between different pirate leaders, mediated disputes that might otherwise have led to violent conflicts within the Confederation, and contributed to strategic planning for major operations. She was developing the skills and relationships that would later allow her to command the entire organization after Cheng Yi's death. She was learning not just how to command a ship or even a fleet, but how to manage a complex organization involving tens of thousands of people and requiring sophisticated coordination. The Pirate Confederation's operations during this period were extensive and economically significant. They controlled large portions of the South China Sea's shipping lanes, effectively taxing maritime commerce through their protection racket system. They raided coastal villages and towns, capturing goods and sometimes people who could be ransomed or sold. They fought battles with government forces sent to suppress them, often winning through superior tactics, local knowledge, and willingness to take risks that government commanders wouldn't accept. They were becoming powerful enough that the Qing government viewed them as a serious threat to imperial authority and to economic stability. Then, in 1807, disaster struck the growing pirate confederation. Cheng Yi died suddenly, likely in a storm at sea, though historical accounts aren't entirely clear about the circumstances. His death created an immediate crisis for the confederation he'd built. Leadership succession in pirate organizations was always complicated because there was no hereditary principle or formal mechanism for transferring authority. Power went to whoever could seize it and maintain it through combination of legitimacy, force, and political skill. Multiple commanders might claim leadership, potentially fragmenting the confederation into competing factions that would fight each other rather than coordinating operations. The normal expectation would have been that one of the male pirate commanders, likely Ching Shih's male relatives or his most powerful subordinate captains, would take control of the confederation. A widow, even one who'd been an active partner in her husband's operations, wouldn't normally have been considered a viable candidate for supreme command. The masculine culture of piracy, the combat skills required for commanding ships and fleets, the assumption that men wouldn't follow female leadership, all of these factors should have excluded Ching Shih from consideration. History suggested the confederation would either fall apart or be taken over by a male commander. But Ching Shih had spent 6 years preparing for exactly this kind of crisis, though she may not have consciously anticipated Ching Shih's death. She'd built relationships with key commanders, had demonstrated her competence in strategy and organization, had earned respect even from men who might normally dismiss female authority. She'd learned how the confederation worked, understood its power structures, knew who could be trusted and who would need to be neutralized. And she possessed extraordinary ambition, combined with realistic assessment of how to achieve her goals. She wasn't going to surrender the power and position she'd worked to build just because her husband had died. Within days of Ching Wen's death, Ching Shih moved decisively to seize control of the entire pirate confederation. Her actions during this crucial period would determine whether she became merely a historical footnote as a pirate's widow, or whether she'd command the greatest pirate fleet in history. The immediate aftermath of Ching Wen's death in 1807 presented Ching Shih with both extraordinary opportunity and mortal danger. The pirate confederation her husband had built commanded over 400 ships and perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 pirates, making it one of the most powerful military forces in the region. But this power was fragile, held together by personal relationships, mutual economic interests, and Ching Wen's forceful personality. With him gone, the confederation could easily fragment as different commanders pursued their own ambitions, or as external enemies exploited the leadership vacuum to attack while the organization was vulnerable. Ching Shih understood that she had perhaps days or weeks to establish her authority before centrifugal forces tore apart everything Ching Wen had built. She couldn't rely on traditional sources of legitimacy. She wasn't a male relative of Ching Wen who could claim hereditary succession, wasn't a proven combat commander who'd earned respect through military victories, wasn't someone who could simply intimidate rivals into submission through physical dominance. She needed to be cleverer, more strategic, more politically sophisticated than any potential rival. And she needed to move fast, before opposition could organize. Her first brilliant tactical move was forming an alliance with Cheng Po-tsai, Ching Wen's adopted son and one of the most capable commanders in the fleet. Cheng Po-tsai commanded substantial forces in his own right and was young, charismatic, and respected among the pirates. He could have attempted to seize power for himself, positioning himself as Ching Wen's heir through adoption, but Ching Shih apparently convinced him that alliance was more beneficial than competition, offering him the position of fleet commander, essentially making him the military chief, while she handled overall strategy and organization. The exact nature of their arrangement isn't fully documented in historical sources, but it appears to have been both political and personal. Historical accounts suggest they became lovers and eventually married, though the timing and formalization of this relationship aren't entirely clear. What's certain is that their partnership was crucial to Ching Shih's seizure and consolidation of power. Chung Po-tsai brought military credibility and commanded loyalty from many pirates who might have hesitated to follow a woman. Ching Shih brought strategic vision, organizational capability, and political sophistication. Together, they formed a leadership team that combined the strengths each brought individually. But alliance with Chung Po-tsai alone wasn't sufficient to secure Ching Shih's position. She also needed to neutralize or win over other powerful commanders who might challenge her authority. She apparently used combination of strategies, offering generous terms to those willing to accept her leadership, forming marriage alliances between her family and other pirate clans, making strategic concessions that allowed ambitious commanders to maintain significant autonomy while acknowledging her overall authority, and, when necessary, using force or threats to eliminate those who refused to submit. One of her most important strategic decisions was maintaining and strengthening the confederated structure that Cheng Yi had created, rather than attempting to centralize all power in her hands. The pirate fleet remained organized into separate squadrons, distinguished by colored flags. The Red Flag Fleet that she commanded directly, plus black, white, blue, yellow, and green flag fleets commanded by different leaders. Each squadron had substantial autonomy in its operations, but coordinated with others for major campaigns, and acknowledged Ching Shih's overall authority for strategic decisions, dispute resolution, and coordination of the Confederation's external relations. This federalist structure served multiple purposes. It allowed Ching Shih to manage an organization too large to be directly commanded in all its details. It gave ambitious commanders positions of authority and opportunity for profit within the overall structure, reducing their incentives to rebel and establish independent operations. It created redundancy, so that losses in one squadron wouldn't cripple the entire Confederation. And it maintained flexibility, allowing different squadrons to operate in different areas simultaneously, expanding the Confederation's geographic reach and economic opportunities. Having established her political position, Ching Shih then implemented the innovation that would make her confederation extraordinarily effective and that demonstrates her genius as an organizational leader. She created a comprehensive code of laws governing pirate conduct. This code was revolutionary in its scope and strictness, transforming what had been a relatively chaotic collection of independent raiders into something approaching a professional military organization with clear rules, predictable consequences for violations, and expectations of conduct that went far beyond what typical pirate operations maintained. The code addressed every aspect of pirate life and operations. It specified how plunder would be divided, with portions allocated to the Confederation's treasury, to the immediate crew that captured it, to commanders at various levels, creating a systematic distribution that reduced disputes and ensured everyone benefited from collective success. It established procedures for capturing ships, for treatment of prisoners, for decisions about whether to sink, ransom, or convert captured vessels. It created accountability for weapons and equipment, requiring pirates to maintain their weapons in good condition and to return borrowed equipment. But the most revolutionary aspects of the code concerned discipline and personal conduct. The code prohibited unauthorized leave from ships without permission from commanders, preventing pirates from simply deserting when they accumulated some wealth or when operations became dangerous. It mandated severe punishment for desertion, typically execution, making clear that joining the Confederation was a commitment that couldn't be casually abandoned. It prohibited gambling among crew members, recognizing that gambling created debts and disputes that could undermine unit cohesion. Most remarkably, the code established strict rules regarding treatment of women, in an era and context where violence against women was common and rarely punished. The code absolutely prohibited rape, declaring that any pirate who sexually assaulted a captive woman or a woman from a raided village would be executed. For captive women who consented to marry pirates, the code required that the pirate husband treat his wife properly and remain faithful,
with violations subject to punishment. These rules were extraordinary for the time, and especially extraordinary for pirate organizations, which were typically characterized by violence and exploitation of vulnerable populations. The motivations behind these strict rules about women aren't entirely clear from historical records. Ching Shih may have been motivated by her own experiences as a woman in male-dominated environments, creating protections she wished had existed for her. She may have recognized that controlling male sexual violence was crucial for maintaining discipline and preventing the kind of internal conflicts that could destroy the organization.
She may have understood that reputation for relative restraint regarding civilians would make coastal populations more willing to cooperate and less likely to support government anti-piracy efforts. Whatever her motivations, the rules represented sophisticated understanding of how organizations function and how to maintain long-term effectiveness. Enforcement of the code was harsh and public. Violations were punished with flogging, maiming, or execution, depending on severity. Punishments were carried out where other pirates could witness them, creating deterrent effects and demonstrating that the rules applied to everyone, regardless of rank or personal connections. Ching Shih apparently personally participated in some executions, ensuring that everyone understood she was willing to enforce her own rules, even when doing so required violence. This combination of clear rules, harsh punishments, and consistent enforcement created an organization that was far more disciplined and effective than most pirate operations. The code also established financial regulations that demonstrate Ching Shih's sophisticated understanding of organizational economics. All plunder had to be reported and registered with fleet officers, with severe penalties for those who concealed captured goods or attempted to keep more than their authorized share. This prevented individual enrichment at the expense of collective resources and ensured that the Confederation maintained capital for purchasing weapons, bribing officials, and sustaining operations during periods when captures were limited. It created transparency and accountability that reduced opportunities for corruption. The organizational transformation Ching Shih implemented had dramatic effects on the Confederation's capabilities. The clear rules and predictable reward structures made it easier to recruit new pirates, as men knew what they were joining and what they could expect. The discipline made the Confederation more effective in combat, as crews followed orders and coordinated their actions, rather than each individual pursuing personal advantage. The financial regulations ensured adequate resources for maintaining ships and purchasing weapons. The treatment of women reduced conflicts with coastal populations and possibly made it easier to recruit women into support roles or even combat positions. Within months of Cheng Er's death, Ching Shih had transformed what could have been a catastrophic leadership crisis into an opportunity for organizational enhancement. She'd seized power, consolidated her authority through alliance with Cheng Po-tsai and accommodation with other powerful commanders, and implemented a legal organizational framework that made the Pirate Confederation more powerful than it had been under Cheng Er's less structured leadership. The Confederation now included over 1,800 ships, according to some historical estimates, commanded more than 80,000 pirates, and controlled large portions of the South China Sea's shipping lanes. The Qing dynasty government in Beijing was beginning to recognize that the pirate problem had reached crisis proportions. These weren't just criminals disrupting commerce, but were an organized military force that effectively controlled maritime territory and that challenged imperial authority over coastal regions. The government would soon dedicate enormous resources to destroying Ching Shih's confederation, sending naval forces, hiring European warships, and offering inducements for pirates to defect. But they would discover that defeating a well-organized, disciplined force led by a strategic genius would be far more difficult than suppressing ordinary bandits. Ching Shih's pirate confederation wasn't just a military organization, but a sophisticated economic enterprise that generated enormous wealth through multiple revenue streams. Understanding how this economy functioned reveals much about her strategic genius. and about why the Confederation was so difficult for government forces to suppress. She'd created something that went far beyond simple robbery, establishing systems that were more lucrative, more sustainable, and more difficult to disrupt than conventional piracy. The foundation of the Confederation's economy was what might be called a protection racket, though contemporary sources often described it in more formal terms as a taxation or licensing system. The Confederation controlled large portions of the South China Sea's shipping lanes, making it nearly impossible for merchant vessels to transit these waters without encountering pirate ships. Rather than simply attacking every vessel and seizing cargoes, which would have disrupted trade entirely and invited massive government response, Ching Shih implemented a more sustainable approach. She sold safe passage certificates. Merchant ships could purchase these certificates from Confederation representatives at various ports, paying fees scaled to the cargo's value and the vessel's size. Ships carrying the certificates would be allowed to pass through Confederation-controlled waters without attack. The system was remarkably organized, with certificates issued on official-looking documents that included seals and identifying marks that pirate ships could verify. Ships without valid certificates were subject to attack and plunder, creating strong economic incentives for merchants to pay the protection fees. This system was brilliant in multiple ways. It provided predictable, steady income, rather than the feast or famine economics of simple piracy, where revenues depended on successfully capturing valuable ships. It maintained maritime commerce rather than destroying it entirely, ensuring there would continue to be merchants willing to pay for protection. It reduced risks for the Confederation's ships, as most encounters with merchant vessels became simple inspections, rather than battles where pirates might be killed or wounded. And it created relationships with merchant communities that could provide intelligence about government operations, and that had incentives to resist government efforts to suppress the pirate confederation. The protection system also functioned on land. Coastal villages and towns that paid regular tribute to the Confederation would be left alone, while those that refused faced raids that destroyed property and took captives for ransom. This created situations where local populations sometimes preferred dealing with predictable pirate demands over relying on government protection that was often ineffective and that came with its own taxation and corruption. Some coastal communities effectively functioned as Confederation outposts, providing supplies, repairs, and intelligence in exchange for protection from other pirates and for a share of plunder from raiding activities. Beyond the protection racket, the Confederation engaged in more traditional piracy against ships that didn't purchase protection or that seemed particularly valuable targets worth the risks of combat. These raids followed sophisticated operational patterns. Scout ships would identify potential targets and track their movements. Multiple pirate vessels would coordinate attacks, surrounding merchant ships and overwhelming their limited defenses. Captured ships would be evaluated for whether they were more valuable as prizes to be sailed to friendly ports and sold, as vessels to be incorporated into the pirate fleet, or simply as sources of cargo to be plundered before the ship was released or sunk. The Confederation also engaged in kidnapping for ransom, capturing wealthy merchants, government officials, and family members of prominent individuals. The ransom system was carefully organized, with negotiations conducted through intermediaries, with graduated payment schedules that allowed families to raise funds, and with generally reliable return of captives once ransoms were paid. Maintaining this reliability was crucial. If the Confederation frequently killed captives after receiving ransom, families would stop paying, and the revenue stream would dry up. The business-like approach to kidnapping made it more profitable and sustainable than if it had been conducted randomly and violently. Ching Shih also established extensive supply networks that allowed the Confederation to operate for extended periods without returning to major ports where government forces might trap them. Coastal villages and islands served as supply depots where food, water, weapons, and other necessities could be stored and accessed by Confederation ships. Some of these depots were maintained through coercion, with the Confederation forcing populations to provide supplies. Others operated on more commercial bases, with villagers selling goods to pirates at premium prices and benefiting economically from the relationship. The Confederation invested heavily in weapons and military equipment, purchasing European firearms and cannons that gave them technological parity or superiority compared to Chinese government forces. European merchants and smugglers were often willing to sell weapons to the pirates, either for profit or because they were competing with Chinese government forces for control of trade routes. Ching Shih apparently understood the importance of maintaining technological advantages and allocated substantial resources to acquiring the best available weapons, training crews in their use, and maintaining equipment in good condition. The financial management of this complex economic enterprise demonstrated Ching Shih's organizational sophistication. She maintained treasuries for the Confederation and for individual squadrons, with clear accounting of revenues and expenditures. She allocated resources for maintaining ships, for purchasing weapons and supplies, for paying crews, for bribing officials, and for building cash reserves that could sustain operations during difficult periods. She apparently employed literate administrators who could maintain records, track complex financial transactions, and manage the bureaucratic aspects of running what was essentially a medium-sized state. The scale of the Confederation's economic operations was enormous by any standard. Contemporary estimates of the Confederation's annual revenues vary widely, but credible accounts suggest they collected millions of taels of silver annually through their various operations. To put this in perspective, this was comparable to the revenues of some provincial governments, making the Pirate Confederation one of the region's major economic actors. The Confederation employed tens of thousands of people directly and supported probably hundreds of thousands more through the coastal economies that depended on pirate spending and protection. This economic power translated directly into military and political power. With substantial financial resources, Ching Shih could maintain a large fleet in good condition, could purchase the best weapons available, could attract skilled sailors and fighters with promises of good pay, could bribe government officials to ignore pirate activities or provide intelligence, and could sustain operations even when the government tried to suppress maritime commerce to cut off pirate revenues. Economic warfare against the Confederation was difficult because its revenues came from multiple sources and because it had built up capital reserves that could sustain operations through temporary disruptions. The Confederation also developed what might be called vertical integration, controlling not just ship capture, but also the downstream processing and sale of plundered goods. Captured cargoes were sold through networks of merchants in various ports, often at discounted prices that made the goods attractive, despite their questionable origins. Some merchants specialized in handling pirate plunder, understanding that the high volumes and low prices could generate substantial profits despite legal risks. These merchant relationships provided pirates with reliable ways to convert captured goods into cash, making piracy more profitable than if pirates had to find buyers on a case-by-case basis. Ching Shih's confederation also engaged in activities that blurred the lines between piracy and legitimate commerce. Some confederation ships engaged in regular trade when opportunities were more profitable than piracy, purchasing goods in one port and selling them in another, operating as merchant vessels while maintaining the capability to shift to piracy when circumstances warranted. This flexibility made the confederation difficult to suppress because ships could appear to be legitimate merchants, making it hard for government forces to identify which vessels were actually pirates and which were genuine traders. The economic sophistication of Ching Shih's pirate empire challenges stereotypical images of pirates as disorganized criminals living hand-to-mouth. This was a complex organization with multiple revenue streams, sophisticated financial management, extensive supply networks, and long-term strategic planning. It was more similar to a modern corporation or a state than to a criminal gang. Understanding this economic dimension helps explain how the Confederation could sustain operations for years, despite government efforts to suppress it, and how Ching Shih could eventually negotiate favorable surrender terms. She commanded an organization that was too economically important and too well-resourced to be easily destroyed by military force alone. By 1808, the Qing dynasty government in Beijing could no longer ignore the pirate problem that Ching Shih's confederation represented. The pirates controlled large portions of the South China Sea's shipping lanes, collected revenues that rivaled provincial governments, and effectively challenged imperial authority over coastal regions. The situation was becoming not just an economic problem, but a political crisis that threatened the dynasty's legitimacy. If the emperor couldn't suppress pirates and protect maritime commerce, what did that say about the Qing dynasty's ability to govern effectively? The government's initial response followed conventional anti-piracy strategies that had worked against smaller, less organized pirate groups in the past. Imperial naval forces were ordered to hunt down pirate ships, to attack their coastal bases, to blockade ports where pirates sold plunder, and to execute captured pirates as deterrents to others. The government offered bounties for pirate heads, encouraged coastal populations to resist pirate demands, and attempted to cut off the supply networks that sustained pirate operations. These measures had defeated previous pirate organizations, and the government expected similar success against Ching Shih. But Ching Shih's confederation was fundamentally different from previous pirate groups, and conventional strategies failed catastrophically when applied against her well-organized, disciplined forces. Imperial naval ships that ventured into pirate-controlled waters often found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by pirates who knew the local geography intimately, who operated in coordinated squadron formations rather than as individual ships, and who were often better armed than government forces with weapons purchased from European suppliers. Multiple imperial naval expeditions were defeated with heavy losses, with government ships captured and added to the pirate fleet. The defeats were deeply embarrassing for the Qing government and for the naval commanders who'd promised to quickly suppress the pirates. But beyond embarrassment, the military failures had practical consequences. Each defeated government expedition strengthened the pirate confederation by adding captured ships and weapons to pirate arsenals, by demonstrating to coastal populations that the government couldn't protect them, and that cooperating with pirates was safer than resisting, and by damaging government morale while boosting pirate confidence. The failures created a vicious cycle where government weakness made the Confederation stronger. Ching Shih's tactical approach to naval combat demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to apply limited forces effectively against a larger but less coordinated enemy. She avoided large-scale fleet battles where the government's numerical advantages might prove decisive. Instead, she employed what modern military doctrine would call asymmetric warfare, ambushing isolated government ships, using superior knowledge of coastal geography to escape when government forces threatened to overwhelm pirate positions, attacking government supply lines and communications, and exploiting poor coordination among different government forces. The Pirate Confederation also employed psychological warfare designed to demoralize government forces and undermine public confidence in the government's ability to suppress piracy. When pirates captured government vessels, they often executed officers publicly in coastal villages, sending messages about the consequences of opposing the Confederation. They released some captured sailors after demonstrating their superiority in combat, allowing these men to return to government forces with demoralizing stories about pirate strength. They spread rumors about pirate invincibility and about government incompetence. The government's response to its initial failures was to escalate commitment, dedicating more resources to anti-piracy operations and reorganizing naval forces under more capable commanders. But organizational changes and additional resources didn't solve the fundamental problem. The Pirate Confederation was better led, better organized, and more motivated than government forces. Government sailors served for modest pay and faced corrupt officers who often embezzled funds meant for provisions and equipment. Pirate crews received shares of plunder and served under leadership that maintained strict discipline while also delivering economic benefits. The incentive structures meant pirates fought harder and more effectively than government forces. The government also attempted to employ divide-and-conquer strategies, offering amnesty to pirates who would defect from the Confederation and provide intelligence about pirate operations. Some individual pirates accepted these offers, particularly those who'd accumulated wealth and wanted to retire from the dangerous life of piracy. But defections didn't significantly weaken the Confederation because Ching Shih's organizational systems didn't depend on individual loyalty, but on structures that made cooperation more profitable than defection. Defectors often found that retirement with amnesty meant giving up their accumulated wealth to government officials who confiscated ill-gotten gains, making amnesty less attractive than it initially appeared. By 1809, the government's failures had become so obvious that the emperor authorized recruiting foreign assistance. European powers, particularly the Portuguese colonial government in Macau and British merchants with interests in Chinese trade, had their own reasons to oppose powerful pirate forces that disrupted commerce. The Qing government negotiated with European powers to bring their superior naval technology to bear against the Pirate Confederation. European warships with better cannons and more disciplined crews would supposedly succeed where Chinese forces had failed. The involvement of European forces created new dynamics in the conflict. European ships were indeed superior in some respects. Their cannons had longer range and greater accuracy. Their crews included experienced gunners who could employ their weapons effectively, and European naval tactics had been refined through centuries of warfare. But European forces also had disadvantages. They didn't know local waters as intimately as pirates did. They couldn't operate far from their bases for extended periods, and they had limited commitment to anti-piracy operations that weren't directly threatening European interests. Ching Shih adapted her tactics to address the European threat. She avoided direct confrontations with European warships where their superior firepower would prove decisive. Instead, she employed hit-and-run tactics, using faster Chinese junks to attack European supply vessels while avoiding their warships, attacking at night when European gunners couldn't employ their weapons effectively, and using fire ships, vessels loaded with combustibles and sent burning toward enemy ships, to create chaos and force European ships to maneuver away from their formations. The fire ships were particularly effective psychological weapons. A burning ship drifting toward you in darkness created terror even among experienced sailors, forcing vessels to break formation and creating opportunities for pirate ships to attack isolated targets. Ching Shih apparently understood that fighting European ships directly was disadvantageous, but that psychological warfare and attacks on their support infrastructure could neutralize their technological advantages. Her strategic sophistication was demonstrated by her ability to adapt tactics based on the specific characteristics of different enemies. Despite European assistance, government forces continued to struggle against the Pirate Confederation. The fundamental problem wasn't just military, but political and economic. The Confederation had created relationships with coastal populations and merchant communities that made it part of the regional economic system. Defeating the pirates would require disrupting this entire system, which would damage the economy and create hardships for populations that the government was supposed to protect. The government was constrained in ways that the Pirate Confederation wasn't. The Qing government also faced internal political challenges that limited its effectiveness against pirates. Different government officials and military commanders competed for resources and credit, sometimes refusing to coordinate operations effectively because cooperation would mean sharing glory for victories. Corruption diverted funds intended for anti-piracy operations into officials' pockets.
Court politics meant that effective commanders might be recalled or undermined if they became too successful and therefore politically threatening. The government's weaknesses weren't primarily military, but systemic. By 1810, after 3 years of expensive and largely unsuccessful anti-piracy campaigns, some government officials were beginning to advocate for negotiated solutions rather than continued military confrontation. They recognized that destroying the pirate confederation militarily would require resources and commitment that the government couldn't sustain, and that negotiation might achieve goals that military force couldn't accomplish. But negotiating with pirates was politically difficult. It suggested government weakness and might encourage other rebellious groups to think they could successfully challenge imperial authority. The stage was being set for one of the most remarkable negotiations in the history of piracy, where Ching Shih would demonstrate that her genius extended beyond military operations to include sophisticated political maneuvering. She'd built an organization powerful enough that the government couldn't defeat it by force. Now she'd need to determine how to convert that military power into long-term security and prosperity for herself and her followers. The outcome would surprise everyone and would demonstrate that sometimes the smartest strategy is knowing when to stop fighting and start negotiating. The organizational genius that distinguished Ching Shih's pirate confederation from other criminal enterprises was most clearly visible in her comprehensive code of conduct that governed every aspect of pirate life. This code, often referred to by historians as one of the most sophisticated legal systems ever created by a criminal organization, transformed what could have been chaotic brigandage into something approaching a professional military force, with clear rules, predictable consequences for violations, and standards of conduct that sometimes exceeded those of legitimate organizations. The code addressed the most fundamental challenge of pirate organization: how to maintain discipline and cooperation among thousands of violent men whose profession involved taking what they wanted by force. Pirates were self-selected for aggression, risk-taking, and disrespect for conventional authority. Getting such men to follow rules and to subordinate individual desires to collective interests required more than just charismatic leadership. It required clear expectations, consistent enforcement, and structures that made cooperation more rewarding than defection or rebellion. The financial regulations within the code were extensive and specific, covering how plunder would be captured, recorded, divided, and distributed. Every captured item had to be registered with fleet officers, who maintained inventories and determined each item's value. The code specified exact percentages that would go to the Confederation's treasury, to the squadron that made the capture, to the specific ship involved, to commanders at various levels, and to individual crew members. These percentages varied depending on circumstances. Battles where casualties were taken resulted in different distributions than captures accomplished without fighting. The transparency and predictability of these financial rules served multiple purposes. Pirates knew exactly what share of plunder they'd receive, reducing disputes and resentments that could arise if distributions seemed arbitrary or unfair. Commanders couldn't arbitrarily enrich themselves at crew expense without violating clear rules, reducing opportunities for corruption that could undermine organizational effectiveness. The Confederation maintained resources for collective needs, like purchasing weapons and maintaining ships, ensuring long-term sustainability rather than just immediate individual enrichment. But the code went far beyond financial matters to govern personal conduct and military discipline. Desertion was prohibited absolutely, with execution as the standard punishment. This rule was crucial because pirate organizations constantly faced problems with members who'd accumulate some wealth and then leave to enjoy it safely on land. By making desertion a capital offense and enforcing this rule consistently, Ching Shih ensured that joining the Confederation was a commitment that couldn't be casually abandoned
whenever circumstances became challenging. The code prohibited unauthorized shore leave, requiring that pirates remain with their ships unless granted specific permission by commanders. This rule maintained combat readiness and prevented situations where large portions of crews might be unavailable when ships needed to sail or fight. It also reduced opportunities for pirates to establish competing loyalties on land or to be captured by government forces when they were separated from their ships and comrades. Gambling among crew members was prohibited, recognizing that gambling created debts and disputes that could destroy unit cohesion. In close quarters on ships, where men lived together for extended periods, personal conflicts could escalate quickly into violence. By prohibiting gambling, the code eliminated a major source of such conflicts. The rule was practical rather than moral. Ching Shih wasn't condemning gambling itself, but was preventing activities that would damage organizational effectiveness. The code's regulations regarding violence and combat were detailed and specific. Pirates were required to maintain their weapons in good condition, with punishments for those whose weapons weren't combat-ready. This practical requirement ensured that the Confederation could fight effectively when necessary. The code also specified rules of engagement, when pirates could initiate attacks, how they should conduct themselves in battle, what treatment should be accorded to surrendering enemies. These rules created predictability and prevented the kind of random violence that would make the Confederation seem barbaric and that would unite populations against it. Perhaps the most remarkable aspects of the code concerned treatment of women and sexual conduct, regulations that were extraordinary for their time and particularly extraordinary for a pirate organization. The code absolutely prohibited rape, declaring it a capital offense punishable by immediate execution. This prohibition applied to all women, captives from raided ships, women from attacked villages, and women living in territories the Confederation controlled. The severity of the punishment and the consistency of enforcement meant that sexual assault was apparently rare within Confederation-controlled territories. For women who consented to marry pirates, the code established rules protecting them from abuse and abandonment.
A pirate who married a captive woman or a woman from a coastal village was required to register the marriage with Confederation authorities, was required to treat his wife properly, and was prohibited from taking additional wives or engaging in extramarital relationships. Violations of these rules resulted in punishments ranging from flogging to execution, depending on severity. The code essentially created a form of marriage law within the Pirate Confederation, ensuring that women who entered relationships with pirates had some protection from abuse. The motivations behind these protective rules for women have been subject to much historical analysis and speculation. Some historians argue that Ching Shih, as a woman who'd experienced the vulnerabilities of female life in male-dominated environments, created protections she wished had existed for her. Others suggest more pragmatic motivations, that controlling male sexual violence was crucial for maintaining discipline and preventing the internal conflicts that could destroy the organization. Still others argue that reputation for relative restraint regarding civilians made coastal populations more willing to cooperate with pirates, rather than supporting government efforts to suppress them. Whatever Ching Shih's motivations, the practical effects were significant. Coastal populations apparently preferred dealing with her well-regulated pirates over other groups that didn't maintain similar discipline. Women in Confederation-controlled territories had better protection than they did in many legitimate communities, where sexual violence by soldiers or officials went unpunished. The Confederation gained moral credibility that complicated government propaganda, portraying pirates as monsters who needed to be exterminated. The code also established administrative procedures for handling disputes among pirates. Rather than allowing personal conflicts to escalate into violence, the code required that disputes be brought before officers, who would adjudicate based on Confederation rules. This created a form of legal system within the pirate organization, with judges, officers, laws, the code, and enforcement mechanisms, punishments for violations. The formalization of dispute resolution prevented the feuds and vendettas that could fragment the organization. Enforcement of the code was public, harsh, and consistent. Violations were punished where other pirates could witness the consequences, creating deterrent effects. Punishments ranged from flogging for minor violations to execution for serious offenses like desertion, rape, or theft from the common treasury. The harshness of punishments reflected both the need to maintain discipline among violent men and the recognition that partial measures wouldn't be sufficient. The consistency of enforcement meant that everyone understood the rules applied to all, regardless of rank or personal connections. Ching Shih apparently personally participated in enforcing the code, including presiding over executions of violators. Her willingness to personally implement harsh punishments demonstrated commitment to the rules she'd created and showed that she wouldn't delegate the unpleasant aspects of leadership. This personal involvement enhanced her authority and made clear that the code wasn't just aspirational, but would be enforced regardless of who violated it. The code created what organizational theorists would recognize as a high-trust environment, despite the low-trust context of piracy. Pirates knew what was expected of them, knew what they'd receive for their efforts, knew that violations would be punished, and knew that the rules applied to everyone. This predictability reduced uncertainty and allowed for coordination and cooperation that would be impossible in more chaotic organizations. The code was Ching Shih's greatest organizational innovation and was crucial to the Confederation's effectiveness. Contemporary accounts from government officials and from pirates who eventually left the Confederation consistently emphasized the strict discipline and the comprehensive rules that governed Confederation operations. Some accounts praised the organization and fairness of the system, noting that it was in some ways superior to government military organization. Others condemned the harshness of punishments while acknowledging their effectiveness in maintaining order. What all accounts agreed on was that Ching Shih had created something extraordinary, a criminal organization that functioned with the discipline and coordination of a professional military force. By early 1810, after 3 years of expensive and largely unsuccessful military campaigns against Ching Shih's pirate confederation, the Qing dynasty government was facing a strategic impasse. Military force had failed to suppress the pirates, despite enormous expenditures and despite assistance from European naval powers. The pirate confederation remained powerful, well-organized, and economically viable, controlling large portions of the South China Sea and effectively challenging imperial authority over coastal regions. But the government also recognized that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. The pirates threatened commerce, undermined imperial prestige, and demonstrated that the Qing dynasty couldn't protect its subjects or maintain order. Some pragmatic government officials began advocating for negotiated solutions, rather than continued military confrontation. They recognized that destroying the Confederation would require resources and commitment that the government couldn't sustain, and that negotiation might achieve practical goals that military force had failed to accomplish. The key question was whether pirates could be induced to surrender their power through offers attractive enough to overcome their current advantages from continued piracy. The government's initial amnesty offers were conventional and reflected misunderstanding of what motivated the Pirate Confederation and its leadership. The government offered to pardon ordinary pirates who surrendered, allowing them to return to legitimate life without prosecution. But these offers required surrendering all plundered wealth to government authorities, provided no guarantees about future economic security, and didn't address what would happen to pirate commanders who'd led operations against government forces. For most pirates, such offers were unattractive compared to continuing profitable piracy under Ching Shih's effective leadership. But Ching Shih was thinking strategically about her long-term position. She recognized several things that would shape her approach to potential negotiations. First, pirate power was inherently unstable. It depended on maintaining ships and weapons, on continuing to attract capable recruits, on avoiding catastrophic defeats, all of which were uncertain over long time frames. Second, she was getting older and couldn't command military operations indefinitely. Third, the wealth she'd accumulated was vulnerable to loss in battle or through internal conflicts if the Confederation fragmented. Fourth, her son figure Chung Po-tsai and other commanders might eventually challenge her authority if opportunities for advancement seemed blocked. These considerations suggested that negotiated retirement, while she still commanded maximum leverage, might be smarter than continuing to fight until circumstances forced less favorable surrender. But negotiation required extracting concessions that would provide security and prosperity for herself and her followers, not just accepting whatever terms government offered. Ching Shih needed to negotiate from strength, demonstrating that the government needed peace more than she did, while also creating paths toward agreement that would allow both sides to claim success. In mid-1810, Ching Shih initiated contact with government officials through intermediaries, signaling willingness to discuss potential terms for ending pirate operations. This opening was itself a strategic masterstroke. By initiating contact, she appeared reasonable and peace-seeking, rather than being pressured into negotiations by military defeats. She maintained the initiative, controlling timing and framing of discussions, rather than responding to government demands. The negotiations that followed were complex, extending over several months and involving multiple rounds of offers, counteroffers, and strategic posturing by both sides. Ching Shih's demands were extraordinary in their scope and audacity. She wanted complete amnesty, not just for herself, but for her entire confederation. All 80,000-plus pirates would be pardoned without prosecution for any previous acts. She wanted to retain substantial portions of the wealth the Confederation had accumulated. She wanted government positions for her key commanders, essentially having the government hire former pirates as officials and naval officers. And she wanted formal recognition of her marriage to Chung Po-tsai and guarantees of security for both of them. The government's initial response was outrage at these demands. Government negotiators argued that accepting such terms would be humiliating for the dynasty, would encourage other rebels to think they could successfully challenge imperial authority and then negotiate favorable surrenders, would reward criminality rather than punishing it. Conservative officials advocated for continued military operations despite previous failures, arguing that the government shouldn't negotiate with pirates from a position that appeared weak. But pragmatic officials recognized that Ching Shih's demands, while extraordinary, were actually less costly than continued warfare. The amnesty would end the pirate threat without requiring the military victory that had proven unattainable. Incorporating former pirates into government service would add experienced sailors and fighters to imperial forces, while removing them from the pirate confederation. Allowing Ching Shih and her commanders to keep wealth they'd accumulated was cheaper than continued military operations. The government could frame the agreement as successful pacification, rather than as defeat. Ching Shih demonstrated sophisticated negotiating tactics throughout the process. She periodically suspended negotiations and resumed pirate operations, demonstrating that she wasn't desperate for agreement and could continue fighting indefinitely if necessary. She leaked information about some terms being discussed, creating public expectations that made it harder for the government to later refuse those terms. She cultivated relationships with provincial governors who had interests in ending piracy quickly, even if that meant making concessions that Beijing authorities found distasteful. She also made strategic concessions on points that mattered less to her, while holding firm on core demands. She agreed to surrender most of the Confederation's ships and weapons, recognizing that she didn't need a navy once peace was established.
She accepted that many ordinary pirates would have to find legitimate employment, rather than all being given government positions. She agreed to public ceremonies where she would formally acknowledge imperial authority, providing the government with symbolic victories that could be presented as vindication of the dynasty's power. One of Ching Shih's brilliant tactical moves was entering Canton personally to negotiate directly with government officials. This required enormous courage. She was voluntarily placing herself in enemy territory, where she could potentially be arrested or assassinated, despite guarantees of safe conduct. But the personal visit demonstrated confidence and good faith, made it harder for the government to later claim she was acting in bad faith, and allowed her to make personal impressions on officials who might otherwise have viewed her as a monster based on propaganda. Historical accounts of these face-to-face negotiations describe Ching Shih as impressive, articulate, and commanding, despite being a woman, negotiating with male officials who weren't accustomed to treating women as equals in political or military matters. She apparently navigated the complex etiquette and power dynamics of these meetings effectively, neither being excessively deferential, which would have weakened her negotiating position, nor being so assertive that she offended officials whose agreement she needed. The final agreement reached in late 1810 was remarkable for how much it favored the pirate confederation. The government granted complete amnesty to all members of the confederation, with no prosecutions for previous piracy or violence. Ching Shih retained substantial wealth, though exact amounts aren't documented in surviving records. Chung Po-tsai was appointed to an officer rank in the Imperial Navy, with responsibilities for anti-piracy operations in areas where he'd previously operated as a pirate. Other pirate commanders received lesser positions in government service or were allowed to retire with their accumulated wealth. The agreement required the Confederation to surrender most of its ships and weapons, to cease all pirate operations, and to formally acknowledge imperial authority. But these concessions were largely symbolic. Ching Shih had already decided to end her pirate career, so surrendering ships and weapons she wouldn't need anyway wasn't a real sacrifice. The formal acknowledgement of imperial authority allowed the government to present the agreement as successful pacification, rather than as negotiated settlement with criminals. The brilliant aspect of the agreement from Ching Shih's perspective was that she'd converted military power that was inherently temporary and vulnerable into permanent security and wealth. She'd ended her pirate career at the peak of her power, rather than fighting until defeated or killed. She'd secured benefits not just for herself, but for thousands of her followers. And she'd done all this while avoiding the fate of most pirate leaders, who typically died violently or were executed after capture. Contemporary observers and later historians have debated whether the government's willingness to negotiate such favorable terms represented pragmatic wisdom or humiliating defeat. Pragmatists argued that the terms, while generous to the pirates, achieved government goals more cheaply than continued warfare would have. The pirate threat ended, maritime commerce could resume normally, and the government could redirect resources from failed anti-piracy campaigns to other priorities. Critics argued that the terms encouraged rebellion by demonstrating that criminals who became powerful enough could negotiate favorable surrenders rather than facing punishment. What's clear is that Ching Shih had achieved something merely unique in the history of piracy. She'd ended her criminal career wealthy, free, and secure, rather than dead or imprisoned. She'd outnegotiated government officials, despite having no formal education or training in diplomacy. She'd converted her reputation for military ruthlessness into credibility as a negotiating partner. And she demonstrated that her genius extended beyond organizing and commanding pirates to include sophisticated political maneuvering in complex negotiations where much was at stake. The transition from pirate queen to respectable retired citizen presented Ching Shih with challenges different from those she'd faced while commanding the Confederation, but requiring similar strategic intelligence and adaptability. She'd ended her pirate career in late 1810 through the negotiated agreement with the Qing government, securing amnesty for herself and her followers, retaining substantial wealth, and obtaining government positions for key commanders, including Cheng Po-tsai. Now she needed to establish a new life that would provide security, prosperity, and perhaps some degree of respectability for someone whose previous career had been entirely criminal. Ching Shih settled in Canton, Guangzhou, the major port city in southern China, where she'd worked in floating brothels decades earlier before her marriage to Cheng Yi. Returning to Canton was strategic. She knew the city intimately, had connections among merchants and officials, and understood the commercial opportunities available there. Canton was also far enough from Beijing that imperial authorities wouldn't pay close attention to her activities, allowing her substantial autonomy in building her post-pirate life. Her first major venture after retirement was establishing a gambling house and brothel, businesses that might seem surprising for someone who'd prohibited gambling among her pirate crews. But the choice was actually shrewd for several reasons. These businesses were profitable, required minimal capital investment beyond securing premises and initial operations, drew on knowledge she'd gained from her years working in similar establishments, and operated in legal gray areas where her reputation for ruthlessness would deter competitors or troublemakers from challenging her operations. The gambling house attracted wealthy merchants, officials, and other men with money to spend on entertainment. Ching Shih's establishment apparently became successful quickly, suggesting either that she ran it well or that her notorious reputation attracted customers curious to meet the famous pirate queen. Or both. She employed former pirates as security, ensuring that her establishment was safe from the kind of violence and theft that plagued some gambling operations. Her reputation meant that people knew not to cheat or cause trouble in her establishment. The brothel business drew on more direct, personal experience. Ching Shih had worked in floating brothels before her marriage to Cheng Yi and understood that business intimately. She apparently treated the women who worked for her relatively well by the standards of the era, maintaining the same concerns about female welfare that had characterized her pirate code. Former pirates and others who remembered her reputation for harshly punishing rape and abuse of women would have understood that mistreating prostitutes in her establishment would be dangerous. Beyond these businesses, Ching Shih apparently engaged in various commercial activities that historians have difficulty documenting precisely because they weren't formally recorded in government archives. She likely invested in merchant shipping, using her extensive knowledge of maritime trade routes and her connections among shipowners and captains. She may have engaged in smuggling or in facilitating smuggling by others, using her relationships with coastal populations and her understanding of how to evade government control. She probably loaned money at interest, operating as an informal banker for merchants and others who needed capital. These various business activities made Ching Shih wealthy and influential in Canton's commercial community. She was no longer commanding pirate fleets, but she was still a significant power broker, someone whose support or opposition could affect whether business ventures succeeded or failed. Her wealth and connections made her someone merchants wanted to maintain good relationships with, while her reputation for ruthlessness discouraged people from trying to cheat or cross her. Ching Shih's relationship with Cheng Po-tsai during these years appears to have been both personal and pragmatic. They'd married formally as part of the surrender agreement with the government, legitimizing a relationship that had probably existed informally for years. Cheng Po-tsai had been appointed to an officer position in the Imperial Navy, with responsibilities for anti-piracy operations, creating some irony in having a former pirate commander now working to suppress piracy. His government position provided the couple with additional legitimacy and connections, while his salary supplemented their business income. Some historical accounts suggest tensions in their marriage, which isn't surprising given the massive changes in their circumstances and the different paths their post-pirate lives took. Courtesan spent significant time away from Canton on naval operations, while Ching Shih focused on business activities in the city. He was trying to establish himself as a respectable government official, while Shih was running gambling and prostitution operations. These different roles and the time spent apart probably created strains, though the marriage apparently endured until Courtesan's death in the 1820s or 1830s. Historical records aren't entirely clear on the exact timing. Ching Shih also maintained relationships with former pirates who'd received amnesty and settled in Canton and surrounding areas. Some worked for her in various capacities, as security for her businesses, as employees in her commercial operations, as sources of intelligence about developments in Canton's underworld and maritime communities. These networks provided her with information and capabilities that legitimate business people couldn't easily access, giving her competitive advantages in her various enterprises. Her influence extended into politics through informal mechanisms. She cultivated relationships with local officials, providing them with gifts, entertainment, and occasionally information about criminal activities or planned disturbances. Officials found her useful both for maintaining order in Canton's rougher districts and for understanding developments among populations that didn't interact directly with government. She occupied a position between the criminal underworld and legitimate society, able to operate in both realms and to facilitate communication between them. Contemporary accounts suggest that Ching Shih lived in considerable comfort during her retirement years, maintaining a large household with servants, wearing expensive clothes and jewelry, and entertaining guests in the style of wealthy merchants or minor officials, rather than living like someone from her humble origins would normally expect. She'd successfully made the transition from prostitute to pirate queen to respectable businesswoman, demonstrating remarkable adaptability and strategic intelligence in navigating very different social environments. But she never entirely escaped her pirate past, nor does she seem to have wanted to. Stories about her exploits circulated in Canton and throughout southern China, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some people viewed her with admiration for having succeeded so spectacularly against enormous odds. Others viewed her with fear, remembering her ruthlessness during her pirate years. Still others viewed her with disdain as a former criminal who hadn't been properly punished. These varied reputations affected how people related to her, but also provided advantages. Being feared and respected is often more useful than being liked. The question of whether Ching Shih felt satisfaction or regret about her life isn't something historical records can answer definitively. She'd achieved extraordinary success by any objective measure, rising from prostitution to command the world's largest pirate fleet, accumulating substantial wealth, securing amnesty and safety for herself and thousands of followers, establishing successful businesses in retirement. She'd survived when most pirates died violently or were executed. She'd exercised power that very few people, regardless of gender, ever experience. By conventional measures, her life was an amazing success story. But success at that level always comes with costs that aren't visible in historical records. She'd spent years in constant danger, had witnessed and participated in violence, had made decisions that resulted in deaths of both enemies and followers. The transition from wielding absolute power over thousands of pirates to running gambling houses and brothels, however profitable, must have felt like a dramatic reduction in scope and significance. Whether these costs and transitions were worth the achievements, only she could have judged. What's certain is that Ching Shih navigated her retirement years with the same strategic intelligence that had characterized her pirate career. She built new forms of power appropriate to changed circumstances, maintained security and prosperity, avoided the fate of many former pirates who were killed by enemies or who squandered their wealth and died in poverty. She demonstrated that her success as a pirate wasn't just about military command, but reflected deeper capabilities in understanding power, in reading situations accurately, and in making strategic decisions that served her long-term interests. Ching Shih died peacefully in 1844 at approximately 69 years of age, ending a life that had spanned the transformation of China from Qing dynasty dominance through the beginnings of the crisis that would eventually lead to the dynasty's fall. She died wealthy, surrounded by family, apparently comfortable and secure, an ending that contrasted dramatically with how most pirate careers terminated. Her death went largely unremarked by official sources, which isn't surprising since the government had reasons to avoid publicizing that one of history's most successful pirates had lived for decades in peaceful retirement after negotiating favorable surrender terms. But while official sources might have preferred to forget Ching Shih, popular memory kept her story alive through oral tradition, through stories told in Canton and throughout southern China's maritime communities, through references in novels and plays that drew on pirate adventures for entertainment. The stories often embellished and exaggerated her exploits, making her more fearsome and dramatic than historical reality. But they preserved the basic truth that a woman had commanded the largest pirate fleet in history and had never been defeated. The question of how to understand and evaluate Ching Shih's life and legacy doesn't have simple answers and depends heavily on perspective and values. From certain angles, she was a violent criminal who led an organization that robbed merchants, kidnapped people for ransom, attacked coastal villages, and killed government soldiers and officials who opposed her. From these perspectives, her success was morally troubling rather than admirable, and the government's failure to punish her was a miscarriage of justice that rewarded criminality. But from other perspectives, Ching Shih was a woman who rose from poverty and powerlessness to command extraordinary authority through intelligence, organizational genius, and strategic brilliance. She operated in a society that gave women virtually no legitimate paths to power or independence, that treated women as property of fathers and husbands, that excluded women from education and from any significant political or military roles. In that context, piracy was perhaps the only available path for someone with her ambitions and abilities. Her success challenged assumptions about women's capabilities and demonstrated that gender limitations were social rather than natural. Ching Shih's story also reveals important truths about power, organization, and leadership that transcend the specific historical context. She demonstrated that effective leadership requires more than just charisma or force, but depends on creating systems and structures that make cooperation more beneficial than conflict. Her code of conduct transformed a chaotic pirate confederation into a disciplined organization capable of defeating better-equipped government forces through superior coordination and motivation. Modern organizational theorists could learn from her innovations in creating accountability, ensuring fair distribution of resources, and maintaining discipline. Her negotiating brilliance demonstrated sophisticated understanding of strategic leverage and political psychology. She recognized when her military power had peaked and when converting that power into permanent security through negotiation would serve her interests better than continued fighting. She understood how to make demands that seemed outrageous, but that were actually less costly for her opponents than available alternatives. She knew how to create situations where both sides could claim victory, even though she extracted most of the substantive benefits. These are skills that remain valuable in any negotiating context. The gender dimension of Ching Shih's story has made her particularly interesting to modern feminists and to scholars studying women's history. She succeeded in domains completely dominated by men, exercising authority that society insisted women couldn't handle, demonstrating capabilities that gender stereotypes said women didn't possess. She commanded respect and obedience from thousands of violent men who came from cultures where male authority over women was absolute and unquestioned. Her success challenged gender norms so fundamentally that it couldn't be easily assimilated into conventional historical narratives. But Ching Shih's relationship with modern feminism is complicated, because her success didn't challenge patriarchal structures systematically or ideologically. She wasn't advocating for women's rights or for changing social systems that oppressed women generally. She was pursuing personal power and wealth, using whatever means were available and effective. She employed the same violent methods as male pirates, maintained the same hierarchical authority structures, and when she implemented protections for women in her code of conduct, the motivations were probably more pragmatic than ideological. This distinction between individual exceptional women and systematic challenges to patriarchy remains relevant in contemporary discussions about women's achievement and equality. Ching Shih proved that women could succeed at activities society reserved for men. But her individual success didn't create opportunities for other women or change the structures that limited women's options. She was an exception that proved the rule, rather than someone who changed the rules. Whether such exceptional cases should be celebrated or criticized for not advancing broader women's rights is a question that generates different answers depending on one's perspective. Ching Shih's story has entered popular culture through various channels, though she's not as famous in Western cultures as some other historical pirates like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd. She's appeared in movies and television shows, usually in highly fictionalized form that emphasizes dramatic elements while sacrificing historical accuracy. The 2007 film Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End included a character named Mistress Ching, who was loosely based on Ching Shih, introducing her to Western audiences, though in heavily modified form that bore little resemblance to historical reality. Chinese and Hong Kong cinema have produced more historically grounded portrayals, though still dramatized for entertainment purposes. These productions sometimes celebrate her as a Chinese hero who defied foreign, European, powers, and who demonstrated Chinese capability despite Qing dynasty weakness. They sometimes emphasize romantic elements of her relationships with Cheng Yi and Cheng Po Tsai. They generally portray her more sympathetically than Western productions do, reflecting different cultural contexts and different relationships with piracy's history. Academic historians have increasingly studied Ching Shih as scholarship on piracy has expanded beyond its previous focus on European and Caribbean piracy. Studies of Asian maritime history have revealed that Chinese piracy was more extensive, better organized, and more economically significant than Western historians previously recognized. Ching Shih features prominently in this revisionist historiography as the most successful example of organized Chinese piracy, and as someone whose career illuminates broader patterns in Asian maritime history. Gender historians have analyzed Ching Shih's career for insights into how exceptional women navigated patriarchal societies, how they exercised power in contexts that formerly excluded them from authority, and how their stories were remembered or forgotten by later generations. Her story raises questions about what counts as achievement for women in oppressive societies, about whether we should celebrate women who succeeded at traditionally masculine activities or critique them for not challenging gender norms more systematically. Military historians have studied her tactics and strategy, analyzing how she achieved such consistent success against better-equipped government forces. Her employment of what modern doctrine would call asymmetric warfare, avoiding direct confrontation where enemies had advantages while attacking their weaknesses, provides case study material for understanding how smaller forces can defeat larger ones through superior strategy and organization. Her code of conduct offers insights into how discipline and coordination create force multiplication effects. Economic historians have examined the Pirate Confederation's economic operations, recognizing that it functioned as a sophisticated business enterprise with multiple revenue streams, complex financial management, and extensive supply networks. The scale of resources the Confederation controlled, revenues comparable to provincial governments, demonstrates that piracy wasn't just criminal nuisance, but was economically significant, and that suppressing it required more than just military action, but also addressing the economic conditions that made piracy profitable. The broader lessons from Ching Shih's life extend beyond specific historical or academic interests. Her story demonstrates that people born into unpromising circumstances can achieve extraordinary things through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. It shows that effective leadership requires creating systems and structures that align individual interests with collective goals. It reveals that knowing when to fight and when to negotiate is as important as knowing how to fight. It suggests that the most important qualities for success aren't always the ones society values most highly in formal education and training. Her story also raises uncomfortable questions about how we judge success and whether achievement through criminal means deserves celebration or condemnation. Ching Shih was undeniably successful by conventional measures. She accumulated wealth, exercised power, achieved her goals, and lived comfortably into old age. But her success came through robbery, violence, and activities that harmed others. Should we celebrate her strategic brilliance while acknowledging the moral problems with how she employed it? Or does celebrating her implicitly endorse the violence and criminality that enabled her success? These questions don't have simple answers, and probably shouldn't have simple answers. Ching Shih lived in complex historical circumstances, where conventional morality and law were themselves problematic. The Qing government that opposed her piracy was itself oppressive and corrupt, governed through violence and coercion, extracted wealth from populations through taxation that sometimes exceeded what pirates demanded. In that context, simple moral judgments about pirates versus legitimate authority seem inadequate. What's certain is that Ching Shih's story deserves to be remembered and studied, not because she was morally exemplary, but because she was extraordinary in her capabilities and achievements. She demonstrated that women could command, could fight, could negotiate, could build and lead complex organizations, activities that society said women couldn't do. She showed that intelligence and organization could overcome superior force. She proved that knowing when to stop fighting and start negotiating could be the wisest form of strength. Her legacy is complicated and contested, but it's undeniably significant. Understanding Ching Shih's unique position in piracy history requires comparing her career and achievements with other famous pirates from different times and places. Such comparison reveals what made her exceptional, even among an exceptional group of people, and illuminates broader patterns in how piracy functioned across different historical and geographical contexts. The comparisons also help explain why she succeeded when most pirates failed, and why her story remains compelling while many other pirates are forgotten. The most famous Western pirates, figures like Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and Bartholomew Roberts, operated primarily in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic seaboard during the Golden Age of piracy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. These pirates have dominated popular culture's image of what piracy looked like, creating stereotypes about peg legs, parrots, buried treasure, and pirate codes. But comparing them with Ching Shih reveals how different their situations and achievements were. Western pirates typically commanded individual ships, or at most small fleets of a few vessels. Even the most successful Western pirate captains rarely commanded more than 4 or 5 ships simultaneously. Blackbeard's fleet at its peak included perhaps 4 vessels. Henry Morgan commanded larger forces during his raids on Spanish ports, but these were temporary coalitions that dissolved after specific operations rather than permanent organizations. In contrast, Ching Shih commanded over 1,800 ships, organized into permanent squadrons with clear command structures and coordinated operations. The scale difference reflected different organizational models. Western pirates operated under articles, agreements negotiated among crew members about how loot would be divided, how discipline would be maintained, and how decisions would be made. These articles created relatively democratic structures where captains could be removed by crew vote and where major decisions required collective agreement. This democracy made it difficult to build large, permanent organizations because ambitious captains would split off to command their own vessels rather than remaining subordinate to others. Ching Shih's confederation operated under a more hierarchical model, closer to naval military organization than to democratic pirate articles. Captains commanded their ships, but answered to squadron commanders who answered to her. This hierarchy enabled coordination of operations at scales impossible under democratic systems, but required stronger discipline and more sophisticated organizational structures to prevent rebellions or desertions. Western pirates typically operated for short periods. A few years was a long career, with most pirates either dying in combat, being captured and executed, or retiring after accumulating some wealth. Blackbeard's piracy career lasted perhaps 2 years before he was killed in battle with British naval forces. Bartholomew Roberts operated for about 3 years before dying in combat. In contrast, Ching Shih commanded her confederation for at least 3 years after Cheng Wan's death and was actively involved in piracy for 6 years during her marriage to him, making her career longer than most Western pirates, despite her eventual peaceful retirement. The economic models also differed significantly. Western pirates primarily captured ships and their cargoes, selling plundered goods in friendly ports or to corrupt merchants. Some engaged in ransoming captives, but this was supplementary to cargo capture rather than a primary business model. They didn't generally operate protection racket systems or tax maritime commerce systematically. Ching Shih's confederation operated a much more sophisticated economic model, combining traditional piracy with protection rackets, systematic taxation of shipping, and extensive supply networks that resembled governmental operations more than criminal enterprises. Female pirates in the Western tradition, Anne Bonny and Mary Read being the most famous examples, achieved their positions by disguising themselves as men and by being accepted as combatants based on their fighting abilities. They operated within male-dominated crews under male captains, never commanding fleets or establishing female authority over large numbers of male pirates. Their stories are interesting partly because they violated gender norms by fighting alongside men, but they didn't challenge masculine dominance of piracy as an institution. Ching Shih achieved female authority without disguising her gender, commanding respect and obedience from tens of thousands of male pirates while being obviously female. She didn't succeed by imitating masculine behavior, but by demonstrating capabilities, strategic thinking, organizational genius, political sophistication that created authority regardless of gender. This represents a fundamentally different relationship between gender and power than what characterized Western female pirates' experiences. The relationships between pirates and government also differed in important ways. Western pirates sometimes operated with official or semi-official sanction as privateers during wartime, attacking enemy shipping with letters of marque that made their actions technically legal. But these arrangements were always temporary and subject to government withdrawal, and most Western pirates operated outside any governmental authorization as pure criminals. They had no realistic hope of negotiating political settlements with governments that wanted to suppress them. Ching Shih's confederation became powerful enough that government had to negotiate rather than simply suppress it through force. The eventual agreement that allowed her to retire peacefully with amnesty and wealth represented a political settlement recognizing the pirate confederation as something approaching a legitimate political actor despite its criminal origins. Western pirates who attempted to negotiate with governments typically found themselves betrayed and executed, rather than receiving favorable terms. Asian piracy traditions generally were more organized and more integrated into coastal economies than Western piracy. Chinese, Japanese, and Southeast Asian pirates often operated protection racket systems, and maintained long-term relationships with coastal populations and with corrupt officials. Piracy was sometimes an alternative government in regions where official authority was weak, providing services like protection and dispute resolution that legitimate governments couldn't or wouldn't provide. Ching Shih operated within this tradition, but she exceeded other Asian pirates in scale and sophistication. The legal and moral frameworks surrounding piracy also differed across contexts. In Western tradition, piracy was defined clearly as criminal and as hostes humani generis, enemies of all mankind, with pirates subject to execution when captured, regardless of formal legal proceedings. In Chinese context, pirates were certainly criminals, but the boundaries between piracy, maritime trade, and local resistance to government authority were often blurred. This created more opportunities for negotiated settlements and for pirates to transition into legitimate roles. Ching Shih's negotiation of peaceful retirement with amnesty, wealth, and government positions for her commanders was extraordinary, even in Asian context, where such settlements were more conceivable than in Western tradition. Most Asian pirate leaders who attempted such negotiations either received much less favorable terms or were betrayed and executed despite promises of amnesty. That Ching Shih secured such favorable terms reflects both the Confederation's power that made military suppression difficult and her negotiating brilliance that created agreements beneficial to both sides. The long-term outcomes also distinguish Ching Shih from other pirates. Most famous Western pirates died violently, killed in battle, executed after capture, or meeting other unpleasant ends. Those who survived often died in poverty after squandering their plunder. Very few successfully transitioned to legitimate life with their wealth intact. Ching Shih not only survived, but thrived in retirement, establishing successful businesses and living comfortably for over 3 decades after ending her pirate career. The historical memory and cultural impact of different pirates also reveal interesting patterns. Western pirates dominate popular culture despite often being less successful or commanding smaller operations than some Asian pirates.
This reflects Western cultural dominance in global media and entertainment, rather than any objective measure of piratical significance. Ching Shih's relative obscurity outside Asia, despite her extraordinary achievements, demonstrates how cultural biases shape which historical figures become famous and which remain relatively unknown. Modern reassessments of piracy history have begun recognizing that the Western Caribbean model wasn't representative of piracy globally, and that Asian piracy was often more economically significant and organizationally sophisticated. Ching Shih features prominently in this revisionist historiography as the supreme example of what organized piracy could achieve under capable leadership. Her story complicates simple narratives about piracy and reveals that the phenomena was more diverse and more complex than popular stereotypes suggest. The comparative analysis suggests several conclusions about what made Ching Shih exceptional. She operated in cultural and geographical context that allowed for more sophisticated pirate organizations than Western tradition supported. She demonstrated organizational and strategic genius that exceeded other pirate leaders even in that favorable context. She benefited from some luck in timing and circumstances, but also created opportunities through skillful decision-making. And she possessed political sophistication that allowed her to end her career successfully rather than dying violently or being executed as most pirates did. Ching Shih's life and career, despite occurring in early 19th century China, in the specific context of maritime piracy, offer surprisingly relevant insights for contemporary leadership and organizational management. While we certainly shouldn't take a pirate queen as a simple moral exemplar, her strategic and organizational innovations demonstrate principles that remain valuable across very different contexts. Examining what made her extraordinarily effective reveals lessons that transcend the specific circumstances of South China Sea piracy. The first, and perhaps most important lesson, concerns the power of clear rules and consistent enforcement in creating organizational effectiveness.
Ching Shih's code of conduct transformed what could have been chaotic criminality into disciplined operations that could defeat better-equipped government forces. Modern organizations face similar challenges in aligning individual behavior with collective goals, and her solutions remain instructive. Create explicit expectations, ensure fair distribution of rewards, punish violations consistently, regardless of rank, and maintain transparency in operations. Contemporary businesses struggle with corporate culture and employee misconduct, despite having human resource departments, legal teams, and sophisticated management structures. Ching Shih managed tens of thousands of violent criminals using principles that modern organizations could learn from. Make rules clear and accessible. Ensure punishments fit violations proportionally. Enforce rules consistently without favoritism, and create systems where following rules is more rewarding than violating them. The specifics would differ greatly from her brutal punishments, but the underlying principles about creating high-trust environments through reliable systems remain valid. The second lesson concerns strategic negotiation and knowing when to fight and when to seek settlement. Ching Shih's negotiation of peaceful retirement demonstrated sophisticated understanding that military power is only valuable if it achieves objectives, and that sometimes negotiation accomplishes more than continued fighting. Modern business leaders face similar decisions about when to compete aggressively and when to seek collaborative solutions. Her example suggests that negotiating from strength, while creating pathways for mutually beneficial agreements, requires recognizing that apparent opponents often have shared interests in avoiding costly conflicts. Her negotiating tactics also offer insights. She maintained alternatives to agreement by demonstrating willingness to resume fighting. She made demands that seemed outrageous, but were actually less costly than alternatives. She created situations where both sides could claim victory, and she personally engaged in negotiations rather than just sending intermediaries. Modern negotiators in business, politics, or personal contexts could learn from these approaches about how to extract maximum value from negotiations while creating sustainable agreements. The third lesson involves leadership and authority, particularly how to command respect and obedience in contexts where traditional sources of legitimacy are absent. Ching Shih had no hereditary claim to authority, no formal credentials, and faced enormous cultural prejudice against female leadership. Yet she commanded absolute authority over tens of thousands of men who came from cultures where male dominance was unquestioned. She achieved this through demonstrated competence, consistent delivery of promised rewards, harsh punishment of violations, and creation of systems that made subordinates successful. Modern leaders, particularly women and minorities who face discrimination and lowered expectations, can learn from how she established authority through performance rather than through traditional credentials. She didn't ask for respect based on position, but earned it through results. She created systems that made followers successful, generating loyalty through mutual benefit rather than through charisma alone. She demonstrated that authority based on competence and consistent behavior can overcome even strong cultural prejudices if maintained long enough and visibly enough. The fourth lesson concerns organizational structure and the balance between centralization and autonomy. Ching Shih's confederation used federated structure, where squadron commanders had substantial autonomy but coordinated under her overall strategic direction. This balanced the advantages of centralized coordination with the benefits of local initiative and adaptation. Modern organizations face similar challenges in determining how much autonomy to grant local managers versus how much central control to maintain. Her approach suggests that effective organizational structure depends on creating clear frameworks for coordination while allowing flexibility in execution. on establishing systems for resource allocation and dispute resolution that reduce internal conflicts, and on ensuring that incentives align local and central interests. The specific structures would differ greatly between pirate confederations and modern corporations, but the underlying tension between autonomy and coordination remains constant. The fifth lesson involves economic sustainability and creating multiple revenue streams. Ching Shih didn't just rely on traditional piracy, but developed protection rackets, taxation systems, and supply networks that provided steadier income than episodic captures. Modern businesses similarly benefit from diversifying revenue sources rather than depending on single products or services. Her sophisticated economic management demonstrates that even criminal enterprises require careful financial planning, capital allocation, and investment in capabilities that enhance long-term sustainability. The sixth lesson concerns the importance of addressing root causes of organizational problems rather than just treating symptoms. Her prohibition on rape wasn't just moralistic, but addressed practical problems of discipline and population relations. Modern organizations often implement policies that address symptoms without solving underlying problems. Ching Shih's example suggests that effective policy requires understanding the systemic effects of particular behaviors and creating rules that align individual incentives with organizational needs. The seventh lesson involves adaptation and recognizing when circumstances require fundamental strategy changes. Ching Shih succeeded partly because she recognized when her peak power had been reached, and when converting military strength into negotiated security served her interests better than continued fighting. Modern leaders face similar inflection points, where strategies that worked well previously become less effective, and where adaptation requires difficult changes. Her example suggests that success requires continuously reassessing circumstances and being willing to make dramatic strategy shifts when analysis indicates they're necessary. The eighth lesson concerns gender and leadership, particularly how capable people can succeed despite facing discrimination and lowered expectations. Ching Shih operated in perhaps the most male-dominated environment imaginable and achieved supreme authority through demonstrated competence that overcame prejudice. Modern women leaders and members of other groups facing discrimination can learn from her example about how performance and results can overcome even strong cultural biases, how creating systems that deliver value for followers generates loyalty regardless of prejudice, and how, sometimes, the best response to discrimination is simply excelling so obviously that prejudice becomes unsustainable. But her example also reveals limits of individual success as response to systemic discrimination. She achieved personal authority without changing the broader systems that limited women's opportunities. Other women didn't gain access to leadership as a result of her success. This suggests that while individual achievement is valuable and admirable, addressing systemic inequality requires collective action and institutional change, rather than just exceptional individual cases. The ninth lesson involves risk management and the relationship between boldness and calculation. Ching Shih took extraordinary risks throughout her career, seizing power after Cheng Yi's death, challenging government forces despite their superior resources, entering Canton personally to negotiate when she could have been arrested. But these weren't reckless gambles, but calculated risks based on careful assessment of circumstances and alternatives. Modern leaders similarly must balance boldness against prudence, taking risks when potential benefits justify them, but avoiding unnecessary exposure. Her approach suggests that effective risk-taking requires having multiple contingency plans, maintaining alternatives even when pursuing preferred strategies, gathering extensive intelligence before making critical decisions, and recognizing that some situations require bold action, while others call for caution. The specific risks and contexts differ enormously between 19th century piracy and modern business or politics, but the underlying principles about strategic risk assessment remain relevant. The 10th and final lesson concerns legacy and how we're remembered. Ching Shih's legacy is complicated. She was simultaneously a brilliant leader and a violent criminal, an organizational genius, and someone who built her success on robbery and violence. Modern leaders similarly face questions about whether their achievements justify their methods, whether success excuses ethical compromises, whether we should celebrate effectiveness regardless of how it was achieved. Her complex legacy suggests that simple moral judgments are often inadequate for understanding historical figures or for evaluating contemporary leaders. People operate in complex circumstances where perfect choices aren't available, where pursuing noble goals requires compromising other values, where effectiveness and morality sometimes conflict. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics, but rather recognizing that ethical judgment requires understanding context and acknowledging trade-offs, rather than applying simple categorical rules. In conclusion, Ching Shih's story offers rich material for thinking about leadership, organization, strategy, and success. Despite the vast differences between early 19th century Chinese piracy and contemporary circumstances, her organizational innovations, strategic brilliance, negotiating skill, and successful navigation of circumstances that destroyed most pirates demonstrate capabilities that remain admirable, even when we acknowledge the moral problems with how she employed them. She deserves to be remembered not as a simple hero or villain, but as an extraordinary person whose achievements illuminate enduring truths about power, organization, leadership, and human capability.